Quebec is often called the most left-leaning place in North America. It has the highest rate of union membership on the continent, subsidized daycare for around $9 a day, the cheapest university tuition of any Canadian province, and a mandatory public prescription drug plan that covers every single resident. Compare that to the rest of Canada, let alone the United States, and the gap is enormous. So how did a province once ruled almost entirely by the Roman Catholic Church end up building one of the most extensive welfare states on the continent, in less time than it takes most countries to build a highway system? The answer starts with a single decade that Quebecers still call simply the Quiet Revolution.
Before 1960, Quebec was one of the most conservative, church-dominated societies in North America. Historians call this era La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness, associated with the long premiership of Maurice Duplessis. The Roman Catholic Church controlled almost every hospital, school, and orphanage in the province, and clergy sat on boards that decided how entire communities were run. Rural, devout, and largely agricultural, Quebec had church attendance rates near 90%, among the highest of any Catholic society in the Western world. Political power was deeply intertwined with the clergy, and the provincial government treated a strong Catholic identity as the very definition of being French-Canadian.
That changed almost overnight in 1960, when Jean Lesage's Liberal government won power under the slogan Maîtres chez nous, masters in our own house. Within a few short years, the provincial government moved to take direct control of the institutions the church had run for generations, from hospitals and schools to social services. It's called quiet because there was no violence and no coup, just an extraordinarily fast transformation of laws, budgets, and bureaucracies that reshaped an entire province in under a decade. Historians still point to it as one of the fastest peaceful social transformations any Western society has ever gone through.
The new government secularized hospitals, nationalized health insurance, and created a public ministry of education, functions the church had managed almost single-handedly for 2 centuries. University access expanded dramatically, and a generation of Quebecers suddenly had free or heavily subsidized paths into higher education for the first time. This wasn't just an administrative handover. The state was replacing the church as the central institution around which Quebec society organized itself, and it was doing so with a clear goal: building a modern, educated, French-speaking middle class that could compete economically on its own terms.
The government also moved directly into the economy. In 1962, it nationalized private electricity companies into a single public utility, Hydro-Québec, turning it into a symbol of French-Canadian economic power and a training ground for Francophone engineers and managers. New public pension plans, a provincial investment fund called the Caisse de dépôt, and dozens of crown corporations followed over the next decade. For the first time, Francophone Quebecers, long shut out of the English-dominated business world, saw the state itself as their vehicle for economic advancement rather than private industry.
As the state expanded, the church's authority collapsed just as fast. Mass attendance fell from roughly 90% in the 1950s to under 40% within 2 decades, and today it sits below 10%, one of the steepest religious declines ever recorded in a Western society. Divorce, birth control, and women entering the workforce all became normalized within a single generation. Quebec secularized faster than almost anywhere else on the continent, and that left a real vacuum where religious identity used to sit at the very center of daily and public life.
Something had to fill that identity vacuum, and it was nationalism. Quebecois identity shifted from being centered on Catholic faith to being centered on language, culture, and self-determination. In 1968, René Lévesque founded the Parti Québécois, fusing the push for sovereignty with progressive social democratic economic policy, everything from stronger labor protections to an expanded public sector. From that point forward, the province's most ambitious left-leaning politicians didn't gravitate toward a socialist party the way they might elsewhere in Canada. They joined the sovereignty movement instead, because that's where the energy and the voters were. This created something unusual compared to the rest of Canada. Elsewhere, politics runs mostly left to right. In Quebec, the dominant axis for decades became federalist versus sovereignist. Left-leaning voters who also wanted independence gravitated toward the Parti Québécois rather than a federalist socialist party like the NDP. And that same party absorbed rural and working-class voters who might otherwise have leaned more conservative on economic issues. Some political scientists argue this is a key reason the province's political system looks more left-wing than the electorate strictly is on its own. There was simply never a strong home for a purely federalist right to consolidate around.
Labor unions reinforced this shift at every level. Quebec has the highest rate of union membership of any jurisdiction in North America, close to 40% of workers, roughly double the rate in the United States. Federations like the FTQ and the CSN became major political and economic players in their own right, running billion-dollar investment funds and shaping provincial policy directly at the negotiating table. Combined with active anti-poverty, student, and feminist movements, Quebec built one of the most organized collective bargaining cultures on the continent, one that consistently pushed provincial policy toward public, collective solutions rather than private individual ones.
The results are still visible today, decades later. Quebec runs its own low-cost universal daycare network, the cheapest university tuition of any Canadian province, a mandatory public drug insurance plan that no other province fully matches, and one of the most generous parental leave programs in North America. Even parties considered more conservative within Quebec's own political spectrum, like the Coalition Avenir Quebec, still defend and expand these programs rather than dismantle them, because rolling them back would be politically unthinkable for almost any party hoping to win a provincial election.
It's worth adding an important caveat here. Quebecers are not uniformly left-wing on every issue. The province has also passed some of Canada's strictest secularism laws, restricting visible religious symbols in public sector jobs, and attitudes toward immigration are often measurably more cautious than in English-speaking Canada. So what Quebec really built isn't simply a left-wing electorate voting a straight ideological line. It's a distinct, state-centered, collectivist political culture, forged by the sudden collapse of the church and the rise of a nationalist movement that happened to carry social democratic economics along with it for the ride.